say, such matters as the dehumanization of the inner cities, the decay of the inner cities, the sufferings and frustration of the people who live in them, the housing shortages, and the lack of the right sort of housing, transportation, heavier and heavier vehicles, belching out more and more poison, unemployment, and many, many other problems. So the cities, Toynbee points out, are the creation, of course, of us as human beings, but as he describes them, they're voracious. They attracted, from the time of the Industrial Revolution onwards, more and more people. Before that, most of the people in this country were self-supporting. They lived on small holdings and farms, and they could feed their families, and there was a bit over, which usually in the form of barter they passed on to the lord of the manor who sold it to someone else, and so on. But basically it was a self-supporting thing. Families supported themselves in an agricultural, rural society. But then the Industrial Revolution began, and this sort of magnet again of money and of, no doubt, the greed of the producers, the factory owners, and so on. They enticed people in from the country. They needed the labor. And then in turn, there was this great wodge growing in size of people. And they needed feeding, and they needed clothes, and all the other requirements of life. So they had to think of ways, how were they going to feed this awful octopus that had been created? And the octopus put out its tentacles, firstly the canals, so that they could bring stuff into the cities on barges. Then the next tentacle went out, it was the railways. And then finally, of course, the roads and the highways, the motorways we see today. This endless appetite for more and more in the cities. So they really are like huge octopuses. It's a very good way to look at it, I think, to meet the demands of the people, the growing populations in these cities. And meanwhile, of course, how were they to be fed? So the farms became bigger and bigger and bigger. Small farms, tenant farmers, were swallowed up by big capitalist farmers, right, who had the capital to buy huge automated equipment of various sorts and to fill their storehouses with chemicals and fertilizers and all the rest of it, to give us, to supply these octopuses and their huge voracious mouths, which I think octopuses have, don't they, with food in endless supplies. So for the past 20 years, we have lived on mass-produced food, mixed up with all sorts of chemicals and horrible processes, such as battery hens. We've had to eat miserable-looking eggs with yolks a pale sort of beige color, bread like flannel, chickens like blotting paper. I mean, maybe some people have forgotten what a real chicken looks like, or rather tastes like. I think so. We've forgotten what a real turkey tastes like. We've forgotten what an egg with a rich, great, golden, thick yolk is like. That is what things were like when I was a boy, because there was no mass production in the farming. It's gone, and as a result, we are eating all this unhealthy, insipid, anemic food, which is a terrible thing, and of course is and must be affecting the health of the people everywhere. This is because the farms grew. It's because in the cities, and most of us probably city dwellers actually here, not all of us, but some of us, because they needed the food. And the farms responded in that way, which was the quickest way. But I'm sure, it's done great damage. So my children, I'm happy to say, I grew their food. When they were at the tender of age of 0 to about 8 or 9, I grew their food. fortunately, I had enough bit of land to do it. And my whole weekends were spent with my mechanical, I forgot what they call them, plough, tilling the soil, digging, cultivating. They had all fruit, food, we kept chickens, everything for them. And they've always been healthy. And I'm sure it's a lot to do with that. And do you know what drove me to do it? My eldest daughter became ill. And I took her to the doctor because she just generally was ill, exhausted, tired, bad-tempered, distressed, and so on. And the doctor examined her, and he said to me, "Mr. Causton, I'm sorry to tell you, your daughter's starving." I said, "What?" He said, she must have been eating a diet which is below subsistence level. She was then about 13 and 14. She had a tendency to be plump. And she was at boarding school at that time. And I discovered then that for a whole term and more, she'd lived on lettuce. She hadn't eaten anything else except lettuce, apparently. That was her diet. And as a result of that, of course, she'd become slimmer, but she was actually starving. So I really thought from that time onwards that, I must never allow this to happen again. And I started my farm. And I enjoyed it too. But they really, they're healthy to this day, incredibly healthy. And I'm sure it's to do with that foundation of good, natural food. Don't you agree? Sorry to blow my own trumpet. Please go and have some good, natural cup of tea. I hope it is. So I think we seem to have reached a rather delicate point, especially so far as young ladies are concerned, which is diet. Not dieting necessarily, but it's part of it. So I was talking about the awful sort of food that most of us have been eating, living in cities anyway, over the last, probably ever since you were born, many of you. And, what a situation this creates and how unhealthy it is. And for one example, when I was young, the only allergy that you ever heard about was hay fever, real hay fever. That is to say, certain people, when they smelt grass after it had been mown or the hay had been cut or whatever, they suffered from this endlessly running nose and all the rest of the thing. But today there are so many allergies that have suddenly appeared. And I have one myself, and I couldn't believe the number of different things that they tested on my arm. Some of you may have been through all that. And of all ridiculous things, the answer that came up was that it was dust. How on earth can you avoid dust? We've all been born in circumstances where there's dust. There'll always be dust. I lived in India for 6 years where the dust was unbelievable, but I didn't suffer from any allergy then. And that was their answer to that. But of course it wasn't dust. I had to discover it through the Causton. What it was that over the years I'd just eaten too much dairy produce. And it was the dairy produce that was causing the trouble with my nose and my sinuses and all the rest of it. This just came through the Causton. And I just naturally, because I chanted to the Causton to know, I refused to believe it was dust. And because that was a strange noise. Because I chanted about it, quite naturally, about a month or two later, I began to feel that I didn't want dairy produce. I cut out milk and all the rest of it, and the allergy went. So the answer is, that there are all these allergies that have arisen over these recent times, in fact. They never used to exist. This is the extraordinary thing, and it is to do with diet. Now, it may be that it's what they put into the dairy produce which was giving me the allergy. It may not be the dairy produce itself, because I've been eating dairy produce for 65 years with no problem at all. So, still the problem isn't specifically solved, but happy to say I overcame the allergy in a natural way. And I think this points to something. we were talking about greed and the desire for people to make money, which is not a bad thing in itself, except when it's overdone. But as you well know, there are, I don't know how many different diets that are being sold by doctors or by companies in one way or another in this world today. And there are people who are making, for a short time, a lot of money out of it, until everyone discovers the diet doesn't work and it goes out of fashion. And then another several diets come up in its place. So you have this world or civilization, the Western civilization is just filled with people inventing diets. But the interesting point is that the diets don't necessarily have a lasting effect. Of course they don't. The diets are not changing the karma which is causing one to be fat, or not to be fat enough, whatever it may be. I remember Sensei saying, you know, fat or thin, no problem, he said. You can be fat or thin, whichever you wish. It's up to you and your faith in the Causton. If you want to be thin, the Causton will give you the wisdom to know how to be thin. If you're fat and you want to be thin, the Causton does it. If you're thin and you want to be fat, if there are such people, then the same thing. It's wisdom. It's wisdom, 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 which you need, not these bloody darts, right, which can undermine your health, seriously. I really feel so strongly about this. Now, I know some of you may not agree, but I ask you just to think about it and not to disagree, you know, like that. It's wisdom that knows what you should eat and what you should not eat to keep healthy and fit and strong and beautiful. Some dietitian who's selling a product, a course of diets, or a doctor who gives you a glance and says, do this, doesn't know. Only your wisdom knows. That's the point. And of course, if you use wisdom, then the dieting doesn't become an obsession. With some people, dieting, or the diet, whatever you like to call it, that they have to follow, is an obsession. It can become their Honzen. They put the diet ahead of the Honzen. If you don't use your wisdom, and instead of that you just accept what all sorts of different doctors and everyone else tells you, then that is something, you know, that is not based on the Causton, isn't it? The Causton comes first. The Causton will give you the wisdom to know what to eat, or if it's necessary for you to consult somebody, the Causton, the wisdom of the Causton will lead you to exactly the right person who has the wisdom to give you the right answer. In every sense, the Causton must come first. Do you follow? And we can do ourselves so much harm, that's the point, if we don't use the Causton. In a sense, it's a form of slander not to put the Causton first over the matter of diet. You're denying the Causton in your life. So, of course, if people, the same applies to vegetarianism. If people wish to be vegetarian, that's fine. But it's not necessarily right for everyone in this world to be vegetarians. For some people, red meat can be, to a certain extent, harmful. It may not suit their nature and character. But for some other people, some red meat is probably very important. It's necessary for their lives. So, to say everyone should be vegetarians, no one should eat red meat, is extremism, a form of extremism. Each person is different. Each person's physical and spiritual makeup is different. For some, red meat is necessary. For some, it may not be. This is the way of Buddhism. I remember one of our members who was a passionate vegetarian. Years and years ago this is, and they went on a private Tosan to Japan, And Sensei met them and invited this person to lunch. And of course, inevitably, what he offered was a juicy red steak. And this lady wondered what on earth to do, and in the end she ate it. And she said she really rather enjoyed it. Though I think she's still a vegetarian, but there can be extremism in that way. It's not a sin to eat meat. It's not slander to eat meat. It is not slander to eat a fish. It's not slander to eat a plant, which is also a living thing. That is the function of these things. Their mission in life, in terms of supporting the planet as a whole, is to provide meat or provide fish, to provide food that is in the form of a plant or wheat or corn or whatever it may be. That is the natural function. Just as bees are eaten by birds, this is the function of the universe, for one form of organism to support another. So in Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, this is made very clear. I think there is a growing understanding of this, and I think there is a growing understanding, and I'm sure you'd agree, about the fact that we've got to produce better quality food, isn't there? One sees all sorts of shops beginning to open up over the last few years, proper fishmongers with real fresh, wet-looking fish lying about on a slab, and proper bakeries that are not producing bread like wet flannel, and so on. This is great, wonderful movement. Maybe some of you are earning your living that way. But the more people that open up such shops, the better, to give people a proper choice, isn't it? And to make their own decisions, basically. And in that sense, I think small is beautiful. So the problem of food is a very, very living one and has to be solved. And we come to a point later when we consider the problem of urbanization, when, as you know, the two authors talked about some sort of movement in the future back to agriculture. Happily, too, over the last few years, there has been a growing movement for farms to become organic farming as opposed to chemical fertilized farming and huge machinery and equipment, that sort of thing, the big farms I was talking about earlier. And the organic farm, where everything is based on natural fertilization and cultivation, is growing. The Prince of Wales has set a good example there, in that all his farms now, everywhere, are organic. The problem with organic farming is, though it's labor intensive, requires a lot of people. This is a bit of a difficulty. But as long as the farms are kept reasonably small, what we want is small farms, and many of them, all producing various forms of good quality, beautiful food, isn't it? This is really the ideal. And that trend is beginning to grow more and more. Even one or two supermarkets, I don't know whether it's true, what they advertise is true, but one or two supermarkets are now selling organic food. This is an incredibly good result. And it's a good sign, because it means the supermarket is being threatened by the smaller shop that is actually selling better quality food. So the more the merrier in that movement. But we also, should gradually try to live on such food. And I'm sure then all the many problems over diet and all the rest of it, they will, combined with our wisdom, we can sort that all out. So the authors then go on to talk about housing. We all know, and I'm not going to dwell on it, the horrors of high-rise buildings. What a disastrous bit of planning that was. And we've all probably seen movies where, on the television, where people are almost expressing a wish to go back to the old ribbon terracing house development which existed in industrial cities, because they had a community spirit there. They had a family spirit. When daughters got married, they moved perhaps to the next street, but they were still nearby to help with the old people or whatever. families kept together that way. And there's a lot of people who have strong nostalgic feelings for those days, even though, of course, the housing itself left much to be desired. But in terms of human spirit, they had it there. And through being forced into estates and high-rise buildings and all the rest of it, they lost it. We've thrown it away. Instead of building on what was there, instead of building and including in the planning, the wishes and desires of the human beings who are going to live there. So again, it's the arrogance, partly it's greed, to make the maximum out of everything. High-rise buildings take up little land, therefore they can be built cheaper, and so on. Arrogant architects earning huge sums of money, designing buildings where they never consulted the people who were going to live there at all. But again, fortunately, there's a movement beginning in this country in the right direction in that respect. So that's wonderful. So, of course, there are many, many other problems. We all know the one of transport. Transport is an incredible problem. We're snarling up all over the place, aren't we? Amazing traffic jams. The air filled with fumes, poisonous fumes, polluting the atmosphere. Every year the number of accidents grows, and these traffic jams get worse and worse. Something has to be done about it. What are you going to do about it? They were talking about this when I was a teenager. They were saying, we're going to have to stop traffic coming into London, except probably certain selected vehicles. When I was a teenager, they were saying that 50 years ago. I've been driving for 50 years, I suddenly realized. And things have got steadily worse. Driving was real fun when I was a little boy. I mean, it was a sport then. It was an adventure, setting off in a car and going anywhere. My father used to spend a whole week preparing his car as if he was going to Timbuktu or the Cape of Good Hope, and all we were doing was going off for a holiday in the Isle of Wight. But that journey was an incredible journey in those days. The roads were tarmac. They weren't rough roads, even when I was a boy. But it was an adventure. The car had an open roof, and if it rained, all the rain came in, and then we put up side screens, they were called, which were made of perspex, with a bit of leather round the edge, and the water still used to get in, and we used to sit with towels over us. And, it was exciting. You always had punctures. You never made a long journey without at least one puncture. So that again was an excitement, especially at night when we'd forgotten the torches and that sort of thing. But it was such fun, and like a great challenge, And then you'd come to a hill. My father used to stick out his jaw, hold onto the wheel, and know that he was going to have to make an incredible change down in his gears, to get to the top. And in those days, there weren't synchromesh gearboxes, so it was a gate change. So there was this tense moment when he stuck his jaw up. We were all waiting for this change, and then, somehow or other he'd get hold of this and do it. And we'd get to the top of the hill, and other people would be left back there, still trying to change gear. So there's an element of competition in it as well. But it was great, but that's all past. And nowadays, motoring isn't fun, is it? It really isn't fun driving. I really don't think so. It's just a chore. I quite like driving, but it's a chore, really, because of this awful business of traffic and the dullness of it all. So I just read, just only a few days ago, I think it was in the Times, a report that 100 years ago, they were getting worried, believe it or not, about traffic jams. 100 years ago in London, there were terrible snarl-up everywhere in London of horse-drawn vehicles. It's hard to believe, isn't it? So the government arranged for a survey, and they selected a point in the east of London and a point in the west, and they drove a horse and carriage from one point to the other, and they found that the average speed was only 14 miles an hour. And just recently, this year, they've conducted the same experiment from the same 2 points with a motor car. And the average speed is only 12 miles an hour. Can you believe it? So actually, we're going backwards. We keep on inventing more and more amazing motor cars with more and more amazing technology, all able to go faster and faster. But in fact, you can only get from one point to another an average of 12 miles an hour. So you can see, how ridiculous this is. But no one has done anything about it. Why? Of course it's because of vested interests. Vested interests in oil, petrol, cars, car accessories, a huge industry. And the thought of throwing that out of gear is more than any government, even it seems Maggie Thatcher, to tackle. But someday it's got to be tackled. For 50 years they've been talking about it. Actually, they've been talking about it for 100 years. And nothing's done. So what are you going to do about it? Not my job now. It's yours. Your future. So I mean, this is just one point of many, many points, of course. What do you want the future to be like? Do you want to go on having your cities filled with fumes from petrol-driven cars and all that it must do to one's health? Do you want to go on, on a hot day having this agony of driving through the rush hour? It's your future. What are you going to do about it? Maybe, I don't know. There are, of course, the solutions, but the thing is, are you prepared to go on living in this way like my stupid generation has lived? And not only my stupid generation, but the next generation up from there. Are you prepared to go on until the average speed of getting across London by car is reduced, to 2 miles an hour? This is the point, isn't it? It's no good saying, it's not my business, how can I do anything about it? That's what everyone's saying. That's why nothing has been done for 50 years. That's the point, isn't it? Something has to be done about it. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that each of your particular concern is transport. But you have a concern because you're a citizen. And because the air is getting, more and more filled with these awful fumes. So it's a point to think about. There is something you can do about it. And that is by doing shakabuku and making more and more people start to activate their wisdom and to become concerned with what's going on around them. There are 3 realms in Ichinen Sanzen, aren't there? The realm of oneself, the realm of society, and the realm of the land. You can't ignore the realm of society and the realm of land. Definitely, if you try to, and you're only concerned, with yourself and your own little patch, the Gehonzen in some way will find a way to push you to become concerned with the society around you and the land you live on. Because the fact is, you cannot be happy unless you are concerned about it and you're doing something about it. It's part of one's life, part of one's environment, isn't it? So I'm not suggesting that you all become campaigners for no cars in London with banners and all the rest of it. Of course not. What I'm saying is that it's a point that you need to consider, because the more and more people who get fed up with this situation and say we cannot go on like this for another generation or two, we've got to do something about it now before it becomes totally impossible to move. So, you can do something on that basis by talking to other people, by making them concerned too, through your concern, and by expressing your views through the normal channels of local authorities and all the rest of it. So, of course, there are other matters. Some of you may be preoccupied with the standard of hospitals, say. That's okay. But some of you should or must have some feelings about traffic, particularly if the only way you can get to your work is driving every day and you get held up, or whatever it may be. Another person may have their child run over or damaged, or an old person or member of the family or something rather maimed for the rest of their lives, you know. Another one suffering from severe bronchitis or something or other through fumes. I don't know, there are all sorts of reasons, but somewhere amongst the cross-section of our membership there must be people who actually are concerned about this point. And they shouldn't do nothing. They should do something. Because the voice of the people is actually, in the end, irresistible to the politicians. They cannot ignore it. And that's why Sensei is talking about this human movement that I mentioned earlier. To challenge this problem of the environment through more and more human beings expressing their views strongly. And in the end, the specialists and the professors and the scientists and the statesmen and the parliamentarians, you know, are going to have to listen. But they won't do anything unless the voice of the people becomes stronger. That's the truth of it. So I'm sure we're going to see more and more this movement unfolding in the future of people who are having the courage of their own convictions to stand up and make a fuss, and of course find themselves supported by others for whom that particular point or aspect is important. So I'm sure that will come. Someday we'll see it happen. So much so that I was just mentioning to the young men, I really feel maybe, since this matter of the environment, in a way it's more insidious than the matter of war. The matter of war is so pressing and so obvious, so long as particularly the nuclear weapon situation exists, isn't it? That threat of a mistake and someone hitting the button, you know, it's somehow urgent and pressing. But the destruction of the environment is much more insidious, don't you think? It's going on all the time. It's always been going on since you were born. And it's very easy just to let it go on because it seems too big, doesn't it? But if you think even about SGI, you know, in all the countries of the world, people feeling the same feelings as you're feeling, with the power of the Causton, and actually being able to do something about it in terms of expressing one's feelings as a human being and one's concern for the future. So I can't help feeling, as I said to the young men, that maybe, you know, we could celebrate 1990 with another form of equivalent to what we call the World Peace Exposition in 1983. Some sort of really ingenious, incredible way of hitting the public, you know, in the stomach concerning this whole matter of the environment or all its implications. Things like education, health, and transportation. All the points we've been mentioning today. No, there isn't. No. Yeah. Well, this would probably precipitate it, because my feeling is that probably we've still got to chant about it and think about it, but maybe this would be a great thing to do. And maybe, you know, the time is coming right to actually do it. As I said earlier, the first phase is continuing. That is to say, people are becoming more and more aware of the ecological imbalance that is created by the destruction of the environment and its effects on us. So I feel the next point is action. So this wouldn't be, it would of course inform, but also it would explain action in some way. I don't know, it's only a thought in my mind, but I felt if we did it, you know, we have 250 members of the New Century Group. So I feel the New Century Group would probably be the people who would actually plan and create the foundations of this exposition. maybe we could take a whole list of different aspects of the environment, many of which we've talked about briefly today, and form a series of teams of people who are particularly interested in one or other of those subjects, and over maybe a year or even 18 months to carry out research into all aspects of it and decide how best to put across the whole problem and its conclusion. Not necessarily the details of such a thing, but in terms of the human revolution and an understanding of Eshofuni and so on, the Buddhist perspective, as it were, on each of those matters. So, do you think it's an exciting idea? It is really, isn't it? It'd be a big work, but maybe it would be a good thing to do. Anyway, we've got to think about it carefully and make sure we feel it's the right time. So, I think it's clear, isn't it? We've mentioned it already, that there are three enemies, really. First is nuclear war and all forms of war. Second is the destruction of the environment. And that includes, of course, overpopulation and the destruction of forests, the exhaustion of natural resources, and thirdly, pollution of the land and the atmosphere. And I think you can add to that pollution of the spirit. It all comes under this destruction. Pollution of the spirit through drugs, alcohol, pornography, and so on. And the third enemy is apathy, isn't it? And that is the enemy that we definitely can challenge first, the apathy. Through shakabuku and through opening the eyes of other people who we can't shakabuku, but who can begin to understand the principles of Buddhism, and particularly Eshofuni. Toynbee said, if these evils were caused by forces beyond human control, resignation and submission might be the only course open to us. However, our present evils are man-made and ought to be man-cured as well. In fact, I think it's the only way. So in terms of the rural areas, I want to go back for a moment now. I think that Toynbee and Sensei, between them, come up with this really fascinating idea that since factories and industry are becoming more and more automated, more and more run through technological processes and equipment rather than human beings, and since this presents a problem in terms of employment more and more in the future, then might it not be possible, they're saying, to gradually create a movement back to the country, back to the rural areas, back to agriculture and farming? And of course, if you combine with that the need for small farms, organic farms, producing really good quality foods, fruit and all the rest of it, this is a very, very interesting idea, I feel. It would need a great deal of education and encouragement to get city dwellers to the country. Very strange for them. But nevertheless, people are such travelers these days. City dwellers of 100 years ago rarely moved outside their cities. Most of them were very poor. They couldn't afford to even travel, except perhaps to the nearest park. But these days, everyone's around everywhere, aren't they? I'm not so sure that it would be so difficult to encourage people to go back to the rural areas. So it's a very, very interesting idea, I think. And I'll ask Sandra just to read, to revise our minds on it, a paragraph on page 52, Sandra.
President Ikeda says, as you say, reversion to let me try that again. As you say, reversion to traditional agricultural methods will demand an increased agricultural labour force, which under current conditions would be difficult to supply. But as automation increases in urban industries, we may expect the segment of the population employed in such activities to decrease. The needed additional labour could then be provided by I can never say that word. Superfluous. Thank you. Superfluous manpower resulting from increasing automatization of industrial processes. It is likely that a reversal in the flow of population from rural to urban areas might take place. Industrial workforces may continue to decrease while farming population continues to increase, with the result that the latter will eventually overtake the former. This seems to be a most desirable course of events, one that will be beneficial to man's physical and mental health, provided that material affluence is guaranteed by automated industries. It is only to be expected that attempts to use little or no chemical fertilizers or insecticides will encounter fierce resistance from chemical enterprises with immense influence in contemporary industrial society. In order to overcome such opposition, it will be necessary to reform the awareness of the masses of the people and to organize an extensive social movement. The current of human culture must now be rechanneled in a new direction. In modern society, the industrial community has always been the exclusive basis of culture. This basis must now revert to the agricultural community. If that is unfeasible, agriculture and industry must at least advance together on an equal footing.
So, Sense again is emphasizing a human movement, isn't he? All the way through this, he's talking about a human movement. It has to be, because the vested interests in the way things are at the moment, in the big conglomerates and great companies, their vested interest in research and technology and equipment and all the rest of it is immense, even as Sensi mentions, the chemical industry on its own. So what can overcome the power of those vested interests? It's only the expression of the will of the people that can do it. The people have to say, I'm not prepared to live like this and to have my children and grandchildren live like this anymore. We have to change it now before the whole situation actually destroys us. So, of course, through Buddhism, we can give a reasoned argument. And the sensei said in his poem, reason is of such importance, because reason, which comes from sincerity, is very hard not to listen to. So I'm convinced, that gradually this is what we'll see occurring. And SGI, of course, will play a very big part in it. So there is hope. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of hope in this country. We could be pathfinders, because we already have a reputation, I think it's deserved, for being more concerned about nature and about the environment than is the case in many other countries. We've led the way in overcoming smog, for example. The smog, the famous fogs, right, that London, was known or notorious for throughout the world. Japanese people still think that London's full of fog. Their vision is really based on Sherlock Holmes. If you read Sherlock Holmes' stories, 75% of them are always in the fog. But actually, that's not an exaggeration, because when I was a boy, the fogs were absolutely unbelievable. They were thick yellow. You could taste them. And they were insidious, because they contained a lot of oil and everything else from the factory chimneys. And I remember clearly as a boy, we had a house in Brockley, and I remember standing on the landing, and a staircase ran down to the hall, a big hall that place had. And you couldn't see the floor of the hall because of the smog that had entered in its oily way through every nook and cranny in the house. And my grandmother actually died that winter through bronchitis created from this ghastly fog. That was when the fogs reached their absolute maximum in intensity and, in fact, horror. People died like flies through it. And the voice of the people became so strong that the politicians had to listen and had to do something about it. And happily, the war came shortly afterwards, and nothing could happen during the war, but immediately after the war there was legislation against concerning smokeless fuel and so on. So the atmosphere of London was free. I'm sorry, I'm going over time, but I shan't go on more than 2 more minutes or 3 more minutes. So we're ahead of a lot of people in this matter of pollution. Tokyo is just beginning now. When I lived in Tokyo, you couldn't sit in your garden in the summer. When you went out again, it was as if you were swallowing grit. Not smog, but just pollution in the air, that was. It was unbelievable. You never saw the stars. You never saw the moon at night. So thick it was. If to this day in the great American Republic, if you go to Los Angeles and stand